Welcome to another AP Human Geography topic walkthrough, brought to you by Mr. Michael, Social Studies teacher. This video is here to help you fill out your lecture notes, understand the big ideas, and maybe even laugh once or twice. So grab your notes and let's get started.
All right, here's the mission for today. We're figuring out how the Von Thunen model explains patterns of agricultural production at different scales. Basically, this model is trying to answer one big geographic question. Why are certain types of farming located where they are? Von Thunen says distance from the market is everything. The farther you are, the more expensive it is to transport goods. And when transportation costs go up, profit goes down. So farmers have to make strategic decisions about what to grow based on how far they are from the market. That's why rural land use forms patterns, not random chaos, but organized zones shaped by cost, distance, and profitability. However, here's the twist. Specialty farming regions don't always follow these perfect concentric rings. Real life has climate differences, soil variations, and global trade complicating the model. So today we're breaking down both the logic of the model and where it falls apart. But before we start building rings and talking transportation costs, let's lock in what you actually need to know for this topic. Main character moment. Today we're turning farming into a map you can actually predict, not just people grow stuff somewhere, I guess. This objective is telling you to describe how the Von Thunen model explains patterns of agricultural production at different scales. Translation. Why certain kinds of farming pop up closer to a market, and why other kinds get pushed farther out. That little light bulb up there? That's your brain right now. Because Von Thunen's whole thing is that distance from the market equals transportation costs, and transportation costs can absolutely ruin your profits if you're hauling heavy, perishable stuff for miles. So the model helps explain rural land use by emphasizing transportation costs tied to distance. But, plot twist, real life doesn't always obey perfect concentric rings. Specialty farming regions can break the pattern because the world has climate, soil, technology, and trade doing side quests. To see why distance and money basically control everything in this model, we need to rewind and look at how land near a market gets priced like front-row concert tickets. Land value is about to act like front-row Blackpink tickets. Bid rent theory says the value of land depends on its relationship to the market. The closer you are, the more expensive it gets. Accessibility equals profit potential, and everybody wants in. Premium land near the market costs the most money. That means farmers can only afford smaller plots. So they go full grind mode. Intensive farming. High inputs, high output, maximize every square inch, no wasted space. It's giving small apartment, luxury rent, make it work. Distance flips the script. Land farther away from the market is cheaper, way cheaper. Farmers can buy or rent more of it. Instead of squeezing every acre, they spread out. That's extensive farming. Larger plots, lower input per acre, still profitable because the land itself isn't draining their wallet. So here's the economic T. Distance controls land cost, and land cost controls farming style. But who actually came up with the idea that distance creates these patterns in the first place? Next up, we're meeting the North German farmer who looked at his community and basically said, "Wait, this isn't random." Low-key, this entire model starts with one guy in North Germany just vibing as both a farmer and an economist. Johann Heinrich von Thunen wasn't just out there planting crops, he was basically doing 1800s data analytics in his head. In 1826, he drops the isolated state, and instead of writing random theory, he maps out the actual spatial patterns of farming in his community. Translation? He noticed that where you farm depends heavily on how far you are from the market. And that distance equals money. Think of him as the original "why is this here" geography influencer. He's looking at land use and asking, if transportation costs increase with distance, how does that shape what farmers decide to grow? And that's where things get strategic. Up next, we level up into the assumptions that make his model work, because this whole setup only functions if the world is basically set to tutorial mode. Imagine Von Thunen building this model in what is basically geography creative mode. First assumption, isotropic plane. Translation, the land is completely flat. Soil quality is the same everywhere. No mountains, no rivers messing things up, just copy-paste terrain. It's giving default map settings. Second assumption, zero transportation barriers, no traffic, no tolls, no surprise construction cones ruining your commute. Just smooth movement straight to the market. Third assumption, farmers are using ox carts, not semi-trucks, not cargo planes, ox carts. Slow, steady, and very distance sensitive, which means the farther you go, the more expensive it gets to move your goods. These assumptions matter because they simplify reality so we can isolate one major variable: distance from the market. And that's where we're heading next. Because once transportation costs increase with distance, the entire landscape starts organizing itself into rings like it's running on geographic algorithm mode. Boom! This is where the model actually starts cooking. Transportation costs increase with distance from the market. The farther you go, the more expensive it gets to move your goods. That's it. That's the engine driving the whole system. Perishable products, like dairy and fresh vegetables, can't afford to be far away because they spoil fast and cost more to transport, so they stay close to the market. Durable products, like grains or livestock, can survive longer trips, so they're pushed farther out. What you're seeing in those concentric rings is basically economic survival mode. Farmers are making rational decisions to maximize profit. Distance equals cost. Cost shapes land use. Land use creates patterns. Let's actually break down what you're looking at in this diagram instead of just admiring the colorful bullseye. Dead center? That tiny blue dot is the market, the urban core. That's the money spot. Everything revolves around that one location. First ring around it: market gardening and dairy farming. Why? Because these products are super perishable. Milk spoils, vegetables wilt. If you're hauling that stuff by ox cart, distance is not your friend. So these farmers pay higher land costs to stay close, but they save on transportation and protect their profits. Second ring, forests. Back in the 1800s, wood was heavy and expensive to transport. Firewood, timber, bulky stuff. It had to stay relatively close to reduce hauling costs. Third ring, grains and field crops. These are less perishable and lighter per unit value compared to wood. Wheat doesn't panic after a long trip, so farmers can move farther out where land is cheaper. Outermost ring, ranching and livestock. Animals can literally walk to market. Transportation costs are way lower because the cows are basically self-driving. That means ranchers can afford to operate farthest from the center where land is cheapest. See the pattern? The more perishable or heavy the product, the closer it stays. The more durable or flexible it is, the farther it moves out. It's not random. It's profit math mapped onto space. Now that we understand how the rings form, we need to talk about that powerful dot in the middle, the single market or urban center that everything depends on. And this is why geography isn't random. It's strategic. Next, we zoom even tighter into the center and talk about the single market or urban hub that everything revolves around, because that one dot controls the entire layout. Zoom in on that blue dot in the middle. That's the market. The main character, the gravitational pull. Everything bends toward it. There's only one. Not three cities, not a trade network, just a single isolated urban center sitting there like, bring me your stuff. Because it's the only market, land closest to it becomes premium. Expensive, high rent, big competition energy. But being close means you barely pay transportation costs. Move farther out, land gets cheaper. But now you're dragging your goods across space in an ox cart, and that costs money. Farmers aren't guessing. They're calculating. Do I pay more for land or more for transportation? That trade-off is the entire game. And since everyone is trying to maximize profit in the same direction, space organizes itself into those clean rings like it's running on economic autopilot. Now that we understand why the center has that power, let's step into the first ring, dairy and market gardening, where spoilage pressure makes distance basically illegal. Look at the center circle. That is the market. That is where all the demand is. Think of it like being front row at a New Jeans concert. Everyone wants that spot because that is where the action and the money are. Now the first ring around it is dairy farming and market gardening. Milk, vegetables, fruit, eggs. These are highly perishable goods. That just means they spoil fast. No refrigeration, no cold chain logistics, no delivery apps saving you. If milk travels too far, It is not milk anymore. It is a science experiment. Transportation costs increase as distance increases. That is the core rule here. Farmers are assumed to be profit maximizing. They are not farming for vibes. They are farming to make money. So if your product can spoil quickly, you stay close to the market to reduce travel time and protect your profit. Now add bid rent theory into this. Land closest to the market is the most expensive because everyone wants access to customers. So only farmers producing high-value goods that need fast delivery can afford that land. Dairy and fresh produce fit that category. But since land is expensive, farms close to the city are smaller. That leads to intensive agriculture, high labor, high inputs, high output per unit of land. It is like living in a tiny Seoul studio apartment but somehow fitting your entire gaming setup, skincare routine, and study corner into it. Small space, fully optimized. So the pattern makes sense. Highly perishable goods stay closest to the market even though land is expensive, because distance kills profit. As we move outward in the next ring, the products change, and instead of spoilage being the main problem, transportation weight becomes the bigger issue. Forests are in that next ring because timber is built different. It does not spoil. A log is not going to wake up and say, "Sorry, bestie, I expired." So perishability is not the issue anymore. But weight absolutely is. Wood is heavy. Like carry your own desk up 4 floors heavy. In the 1800s, there are no trucks, no highways, no Amazon Prime. You are moving this with animals and carts. Every extra kilometer costs money. And remember, transportation costs increase with distance. That rule never changes. So timber cannot be too far from the market because hauling heavy stuff long distances eats your profit alive. But it also does not need to be right next to the city like milk does. It can sit one ring out, close enough to manage transportation costs, far enough to avoid the most expensive land. And wood was not optional back then. It was essential. Heating, cooking, building houses. It was giving survival mode, not aesthetic Pinterest cabin vibes, so the city constantly demanded it. This is still bid-rent logic playing out. Land closest to the market is the most expensive. Dairy farmers pay top-tier prices because they need speed. Timber producers can tolerate slightly more distance, so they settle in the next ring where land is cheaper but still profitable. So now the pattern is leveling up. First ring was, if it spoils, stay close. Second ring is, if it is heavy, stay kinda close. When we move to the next ring, you will see crops that are way more chill about distance, which completely changes how big the farms can be. Imagine you are looking at that target-looking diagram like it is a map of what farmers would do if they were trying to maximize profit and not waste money on hauling stuff. This ring is the grains and cereal crop zone, so think wheat, rice, corn, and other grains that are way less dramatic than milk or strawberries. They do not go bad super fast, so farmers can chill a little on speed and still get them to the market in good condition. That is why this ring sits farther out from the center. Being farther out usually means cheaper land because of distance decay. The farther you are from the market, the less people want to pay for that land, so the rent drops. And because the land is cheaper out here, farmers can go extensive instead of intensive, meaning they can use a lot more land with fewer inputs per acre and still come out on top. Now look at the diagram again and notice how this ring is bigger than the inner ones. That is the whole vibe. You need space for huge fields, not tiny, expensive plots. The crops are also easier to move compared to heavy timber, so transportation costs do not bully the profit as much. Quick Bangkok example. This is like ordering a giant bag of rice or cereal in bulk. It can sit at home for a while and it is not going to instantly turn into sadness, so you can buy it from farther away and still be fine. Or think of merch shipping. A photo card can survive a longer trip way easier than an iced milk drink that is going to be cooked by the heat before it arrives. Same logic, different era. Next up, the rings keep pushing outward, and we get to livestock ranching, where the animals basically handle the transportation themselves by walking to the market, like they are headed to a Stray Kids fan event. Finally, we are in the outer ring. This is livestock ranching, and honestly, this ring is kind of the chill giant of the whole model. Animals are not perishable while they are alive. A cow is not going to spoil on the way to market. It literally walks itself there. Transportation cost is low because the product moves on its own. That is elite efficiency. So if transportation costs are proportional to distance and your cows can just walk, you can be way farther from the city and still make profit. That is why this ring is the outermost one. Land out here is cheaper. Why? Because it is far from the market. And according to bid rent theory, the farther you are from the central market, the lower the land value. But ranchers actually like that. They need huge amounts of land for grazing. This is extensive agriculture, meaning large areas of land with relatively low inputs per acre. It is the opposite of the intensive farming you saw near the center. Think about it like this. Dairy farming near the city is giving high maintenance, always on, posting daily. Ranching is giving soft launch, low effort, big space energy. The cows are just out there touching grass for real. This whole pattern shows how distance, transportation costs, perishability, and land value all work together. The products that need speed stay close. The products that are heavy stay kind of close. The products that can move themselves or last a long time can afford to be far away. And once you zoom out and look at all the rings together, you can see the full flex of this model. It is not random. It is all about profit, distance, and who can handle the journey to the market without losing money. So Von Thunen really said, one market, isolated state, no outside influence like the world was living in airplane mode. That is the first problem. Today, we do not have one central market. We have multiple market centers connected through a global supply chain. Bangkok alone is plugged into Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai, Louisiana. Farmers are not just thinking about one city in the middle of a circle. They are thinking global commodity chains. Your strawberries might be grown in one country, packaged in another, and eaten somewhere completely different. The isolated state idea. That is giving main character energy in a world full of side quests. Second issue. Food preservation changed the entire game. Back then, perishability was a villain. Milk spoiled fast. Vegetables spoiled fast. So distance basically controlled everything. But now we have refrigeration, freezing, canned goods. Cold chain logistics is doing heavy lifting. Perishability still matters, but it is not as dramatic. It is like upgrading from 2G internet to fiber. Distance decay still exists, but it is not bullying farmers the same way. Third problem. Transportation infrastructure today is built different. Von Thunen was thinking ox carts. We are thinking container ships, cargo trains, highways, air freight. Transportation costs are still related to distance, but economies of scale make long-distance shipping way cheaper per unit. That weakens the perfect ring structure. You can grow something far away and still make profit because logistics leveled up. And then government policies enter the chat. Subsidies, tariffs, land use zoning, crop incentives. The model assumes pure profit maximization based on bid rent and transportation cost. But in real life, governments can literally pay farmers to grow certain crops. That overrides simple distance logic. It is not just what is closest, it is also who is getting funded. So the model is still iconic for explaining bid rent theory, transportation costs, perishability, and why distance matters. But the modern world said plot twist. Globalization, preservation tech, infrastructure, and policy all bend the rules. Now next, we are going to see how even the physical landscape itself refuses to cooperate with those perfect little circles. First, wood is no longer the main source of heating, cooking, or building material. Back in Von Thunen's time, firewood and timber were essential goods. That is why forests were placed relatively close to the market in the original ring system. People needed wood constantly. It was survival energy. But now, most cities are not depending on nearby forests for daily heat or cooking. We use electricity, gas, concrete, steel. So the logic that forests must be near the urban center does not hold the same power anymore. That entire ring loses relevance in modern land use patterns. Second, forests today are usually not near communities. Urban expansion pushes forests farther away. Conservation policies protect certain areas. Industrial logging might happen far from cities and ship products globally. So the old idea that timber production neatly wraps around the city is kind of outdated. Now look at the diagram comparing the isolated state to modified conditions. In the isolated state, everything is symmetrical. Clean circles, perfect rings, main character geometry. But once you add real physical features like a navigable river or a subcenter, the rings warp. That is because the model originally assumes an isotropic plane. That means flat land, equal soil fertility, no rivers, no mountains, no variation. In real life, we live on a non-isotropic plane. Rivers reduce transportation costs along their path. Subcenters create multiple demand nodes. Mountains block movement. Highways shift accessibility. So instead of perfect circles, you get stretched, distorted patterns. It is like the model tried to use a beauty filter, and real geography said no filter, raw camera only. So this limitation is basically saying the theory works as a simplified framework, but once you add modern energy sources and real-world physical geography, the clean ring pattern starts bending fast. Now in the next one, we zoom into how climate and specialty farming completely ignore those neat economic rings. Okay, this one is basically saying the environment said, I don't care about your perfect circles. Von Thunen assumes no terrain variation and no climatic variation, just one big flat isotropic plane where every farmer is dealing with the same soil and the same weather. That is already suspicious. Now look at the left map. That is the clean theory version. One market. Crops ranked by rent-paying ability. No climate differences. So everything bends nicely around the market like it is orbiting New York City. But then look at the right map. Once you add climatic variation, suddenly specialty farming pops up in very specific places. That is because some crops are climate picky. Mediterranean agriculture is not just a vibe, it is a climate requirement. Grapes, olives, citrus, they need dry summers and mild, wet winters. You cannot just grow them anywhere because the bid rent says so. This is where environmental possibilism steps in and says profit is important, but nature still has boundaries. Soil type matters, rainfall matters, temperature matters. You cannot outbid bad climate, so the original model ranks crops purely by economic logic, like whoever can pay the most rent gets the closest land. But specialty crops are not playing that game. They are locked into certain regions because of physical geography. It is like trying to open a winter fashion store in Bangkok. You can try, the market might be strong, but the climate is going to humble you. So this limitation shows that agricultural patterns are not shaped by transportation cost and bid rent alone. They are also shaped by climate regions, soil fertility, and environmental constraints. Once you factor in real-world physical geography, those neat rings start looking more like a rough sketch than a final draft. So now that we've dragged Von Thunen a little, upgraded him with refrigeration, highways, climate reality, and global supply chains, let's pull everything back together and see what still survives the chaos. All right, let's actually recap this without turning it into a boring history documentary. Von Thunen's whole idea was that farmers are strategic. They look at distance to the market, transportation costs, land rent, and profit, and then decide what to grow. The closer you are to the city, the more expensive the land, so you grow high-value, perishable stuff like dairy and market gardening. The farther you go, the cheaper the land, so you switch to things that can handle distance, like grains or livestock. It's basically agricultural survival mode based on maximizing profit, but the real world said plot twist. We don't have just one market anymore. We have multiple market centers connected by global supply chains. We have refrigeration, container ships, highways, airplanes, and cold storage. Perishable goods are not nearly as stressed about distance as they were in the 1800s. Wood is no longer the main source of heating and building material, so forests don't automatically sit right next to cities. Physical features like rivers, mountains, and climate variations create non-isotropic conditions, which means the land is not perfectly uniform like the model assumes. And then you add government policies, subsidies, trade agreements, and suddenly the neat little rings start looking messy. So here's the big takeaway. The model is not meant to perfectly describe today's world. It is a simplified framework. It helps us understand how transportation costs, land rent, perishability, and profit influence land use patterns. Even in 2026, with global trade and advanced technology, the core logic still hits. Distance still matters. Cost still matters. Farmers and corporations still care about maximizing profit. That's the recap. Simple idea, powerful logic, messy real world. Now get ready, because the bonus question is about to test whether you actually absorbed that or just nodded along. Bonus question time. No warm-up, no hints, just you and your brain. Imagine Von Thunen walks into 2026 and sees refrigerated trucks, cargo ships, highways, air freight, multiple market centers, climate differences, government subsidies, and global trade networks. Does his model still help explain agricultural land use patterns today, or is it completely outdated? You cannot just say yes or no. You have to use concepts like transportation costs, land rent, perishability, profit maximization, and the idea of an isolated state versus the real world. If you argue it still works, prove it with evidence. If you argue it fails, explain exactly why and where it breaks down. This is not a vibes answer. This is a back it up with receipts answer. Drop your answer in the comments and back it up with examples. And don't forget to add your name for that bonus point. Let's see who actually locked in.